Yo, what's good, family? Shalom. In this video, we're going to be chopping it up about this forgotten African Hebrew playwright that's 10 times better than Shakespeare. The reason he's so dope is because he sheds light on the way that ancient Israelites thought about God. Their God, Yahweh, revealed to them in Exodus 3:14, his personal name, as revealed to Moses. That itself is going to play a role later. But not only do we have this ancient African Hebrew playwright, and that in itself, the oldest play in the history of the Israelite people. Not only is that in itself interesting, but the lens it shows us into how ancient Hebrews thought about God, the first audience of the scriptures, both in the time of Christ and before him. The reason I make this video is because there's a lot of people in the church and even messianic who believe in Jesus, whose theology is often rabbinic. In the church, they're called Unitarians, who reject any complexity of God's nature and reject that Jesus is God. As far as many messianic people, there are many Hebrew Israelites that claim a Hebrew identity, and many of them embrace the Messiah, but what they don't realize is that their theology is often rabbinic as opposed to Hebraic. See, after the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, we can begin to track when the rabbis changed their understanding of the nature of God, and we don't realize we go with that presupposition. But if we go from the root outward, what the original diaspora believed about God, the original diaspora of the Israelites, we can have all these records left behind, and it shows that they clearly believed that God had a complex nature. They clearly believed that God could come in a visible form, God could come in an embodied form, and God was just a complex being. Well, there was only one Most High, and the Lord is one. That one Most High was complex, sometimes in two forms at once. So we're going to dive in. So when we begin to look at these records, we can see that these Hebrews got these things from studying their scriptures, studying the prophets and the law and the Old Testament at face value, and trying to debate among themselves, culturally speaking, about who the messenger of the Lord was, the angel of the Lord figure who spoke on God's behalf and spoke with the Most High's authority. They had different identifications on who that figure was. And we're going to start that discussion with Ezekiel the Tragedian, Ezekiel the poet, Ezekiel the playwright. Most people haven't even heard of before, including me. But this ancient African playwright sheds light. So with that being said, let me introduce you to this brother named Ezekiel. We can actually read about him from church fathers, which is interesting. We don't have any works from himself preserved, but he's mentioned in various church fathers, so much so that we could put together a solid glimpse, a solid understanding of what his play was about. Now, he wrote in Alexandria. I think that he was from Alexandria, but we know that he wrote the play in Alexandria, which is in Egypt, or Kemet. So he was stationed in North Africa. He was stationed in like the center of North African Israelites in those times, which was Alexandria, right? And right, it makes sense. After Alexander the Great was conquering places, they would often name the cities after him. So that's where you get Alexandria. And here this brother writes a play called the Exagoge, or the Exodus, which we can read about in the book of Exodus. So if y'all catch my drift, y'all have the book of Exodus in our Old Testament, and this brother was making a play about it from Alexandria. We're going to actually read what he wrote, which has been preserved for us in the church fathers. Now, his works were preserved in Eusebius, Clement of Alexandria, another individual from Alexandria, and Pseudo Eustathius. Okay? I recommend y'all peep the original sources, especially Eusebius, the first guy, because there's a lot of dope stuff that I'm going to circle back to. All links will be in the description. I highly recommend you read the original text. Eusebius, who was one of the church fathers, one of the Gentiles in the church. You should read his work about, I'll link it, I'll put a picture on the screen because I don't know how to pronounce it. But it's really interesting. He got some stuff in there about how the Ethiopians invaded Egypt. He talked about, how the Ethiopians were dark-skinned. It talks about Zipporah, Moses' wife. It talks about how the Greeks acknowledged and exalted Moses as one of these wisest Why is this people from a volatile? There's a lot of interesting stuff, and I'm going to bring it to a specific passage. But I get joy reading these things because I love to see, especially, in our modern time, but even in the early church, seeing these Gentile believers engage with the Hebraic. You know what I'm saying? Like this hat represents the way God's name was represented in ancient times, in ancient Zion. I love seeing Gentiles interact with, the Hebraic and exalting the ancient Hebrews, because that is also a testimony to the Most High's influence over the nations. The Most High reclaiming these nations for himself, and we can see by their adherence to Christ, them willingly following him and following these precepts of the Torah, such as justice, mercy, faithfulness, prioritizing God and loving your neighbor as yourself, and all of these different things that we could track because of the gospel spreading, the good news of Christ, and putting that against the backdrop of places like Isaiah 11. So with all that being said, we're going to hone in on a specific passage. Again, I linked the original text in the description, but we're going to link about Moses and about how this relates to the greater discussion of the nature of God. So here is the specific passage from the text. So this is from Eusebius's perspective, Eusebius's pen. He says, Ezekiel also speaks of this in the Exodus, adding to the tradition the dream that was seen by Moses and interpreted by his father-in-law. And Moses himself talks with his father-in-law in alternate verses as follows. So now he's quoting from Ezekiel's play. This is what it says. Methought upon Mount Sinai's brow, I saw a mighty throne that reached the heaven's high vault, whereon there sat a man of noblest mien, wearing a royal crown, whose left hand held a mighty scepter, and his right to me made a sign, and I stood forth before the throne. He gave me then the scepter and the crown, and bade me sit upon the royal throne from which himself removed. Thence I looked forth upon the earth's wide circle, and beneath the earth itself, and high above the heaven. Then at my feet, behold, 1,000 stars began to fall, and I their number told, as they passed by me like an armed host, and I in terror started up from sleep. Now, first of all, this play has Ezekiel, who's the playwright, has God portrayed as a man. I told y'all this was better than Shakespeare. The Most High is portrayed as a man. This is coming from an ancient Israelite source hundreds of years before Christ. No matter how you want to slice it, either 200s BC or 300s BC. This is coming years and years and years and years before Christ, who have God appearing as a man. Why is that important? Well, because he's ultimately getting this from the scriptures, okay? And before we trace back to the scriptures, we know that it's not just an appearance of a man, but it's actually a man. The text says it was a man. And when we look further beyond that statement, it talks about how he was wearing a crown and holding a scepter. So obviously this was an embodied individual that you can imagine wearing a crown and holding a scepter is what God is portrayed on this giant throne atop Mount Sinai. Obviously, if we read the Exodus, we know it's the Lord appearing to them at Mount Sinai. And here, this giant throne has this human figure representing the Lord. Okay, so that's number one. And we have various instances about how this corresponds to the portrayal of Yad-Vaveh in the scriptures. We have Jacob wrestling with God. We have the visitor of Abraham in Genesis 18. I'll start with these two passages because this isn't just an appearance of a man. There are some verses where God appears like a man, but these two, it actually is a man because the people interact with them in tangible ways. I believe in Abraham's story, the visitor who was God appearing to them actually ate. So we know God who never hungers or thirsts was in a capacity to eat because it came down in a human form with the other angels and visited Abraham. So not only is God eating in embodied form and Jacob wrestling with God, he's actually wrestling with him so much so that he I believe he dislocates Jacob's hip in the wrestling match. So now we can see that in the scriptures, what they teach is that not only can God appear as a man, God can actually take the form of an actual man because this ancient Hebrews interacted with the Lord in this way. And while it seems strange to us now, the ancient audience had no problem recognizing this in multiple sources. It's not just this one. This is like a cherry on top. No, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's a bunch of other sources that have other ideas about who this figure is, but they recognized the visible appearance of Yah point blank. It seems fitting. We're reading a playwright, this ancient Israelite, this ancient Jew that wrote plays named Ezekiel. It seems fitting that we should actually read the prophet Ezekiel. So in Ezekiel 1:26, this is what the scriptures say. And above the expanse over their heads, there was a likeness of a throne, an appearance like sapphire. And seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. So here, right when the book of Ezekiel opens up this grand vision of the cherubim and the Most High up top this mobile throne, he is appearing as a man. So we have right in the prophet of the same name, God appearing as a human being, which we can also cross-reference in the prophet Daniel. Daniel 7, starting at verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So the prophet Daniel has this vision where this human figure comes riding on the clouds, is presented to Yahweh, is presented to the Most High, and he himself was given this eternal glory and dominion and a kingdom that parallels what is spoken of the eternal kingdom of the Messiah in the Bible, in places like Isaiah, I believe it's Isaiah 9, verses 6 to 7. We could just see the parallel among the different prophets that relate to this overall profile of the Messiah, that we can see these pieces and see how they relate to Christ on a non-presuppositional level. I digress a little bit. The importance of me quoting this vision is the fact that the human comes in on clouds. Only the Most High rides on clouds. The Bible is very clear to make this point. No angel, no archangel ever rides on clouds. The only one who is to do it in the scriptures is the Most High. He is the one riding on the clouds. And the reason we know that is because it was understood as a pagan symbol of Baal. It was understood as something other gods did. So what the scriptures are doing is teaching it's not these other gods that ride clouds. It's actually the Most High. It's the God of Israel that rides clouds. Okay? So when we have this as a backdrop, when we get to the prophet Daniel, the fact that this other guy is riding clouds means that this human appearance is riding clouds and doing something the scriptures teach only God is supposed to do. Not only that, he gets served by every nation, every tongue in the world that parallels the type of glory and worship and recognition that goes to the Most High. So when we put all these things together, especially studying them in the original context, because remember, the children of Israel were the first audience of the scriptures before the Gentiles were grafted in through Christ. So when we have the time and place the scriptures were written, and we take that into account, when we have these things in the scriptures, and we look at the writings of the ancient Israelites, such as Ezekiel the playwright, it encourages us just to take the scriptures at face value, because we can understand the way the first audience took it at face value and had these concepts working in their minds. It also teaches us to check many of our own presuppositions, because a lot of what we believe, we can check and see the developments of things that don't ultimately go back to the beginning. Okay, I could bring up the rapture doctrine as an example. This is no shade. I don't have a formal opinion about the rapture. I got to study more about it. But I do know is that that's a development that wasn't present or taught in the very beginning. So in a similar way, we got to check our understanding of things, because we can see the clear development of the nature of God among the Jewish population, and that the rabbis developed their doctrine after the destruction of the temple about the year 100, that was alienated from the way the original diaspora, original diaspora thought about God as left behind in their records. Because it's not just Ezekiel. There's a bunch of other guys and other books, even including Enoch, that show there was a bigger cultural conversation going on among the scattered tribes about how their God existed in the world or beyond the world. So not only does Ezekiel, this ancient Jewish playwright from Alexandria, from Kemet, from Egypt, from Africa, portray God as a man, which is consistent with the scriptures, he actually puts Moses in God's seat. Think about that. he puts Moses in God's seat. And obviously he doesn't see it as any kind of sin, because we know he's making a play about the Exodus, and Exodus clearly teaches that y'all shall have no other gods before me. So obviously this is someone who has the presupposition, so much so that he's actually making a play in the name of his God, that there is only one God that deserves to be worshipped, and yet he's having Moses in that position of authority in his interpretation. So we got to read, he gave me then the scepter and the crown, and bade me sit upon the royal throne, from which himself removed. So think about how crazy this is. In the play, this is a dream that Moses is having, okay? And in the dream, not only is Moses getting on God's seat, God is getting off. So God gets off of his throne. He gives Moses the crown of God. He gives Moses the scepter of God, puts Moses on the seat, lets Moses get on the seat, the throne of God, and himself gets off. So it's not that they're sharing the seat. God gets off and Moses is on the throne, this huge throne atop Mount Sinai. And once he gets on, he sees basically the entire world underneath him, because we know that in the Bible, stars were understood as spiritual beings. Stars were worshipped by the nations. Deuteronomy 4:19. So when he's on the throne of God and he sees thousands of stars, he sees thousands of these beings, thousands of the heavenly host underneath him, submitted to him. So Moses is so highly exalted in a position that no other human being can say. So to recap, embodied God gets off the throne and gives Moses his throne. God is essentially giving Moses his authority in this dream, in this vision, in this play called the Exegoge. So not only does this on one hand portray God, that he can appear as an embodied form in his mind, this ancient African Jew I want to emphasize, that's number one. But number two, what it shows us is that by definition, this is an identification of God's visible presence. Look at other Hebrew texts and see how they identified maybe Yahweh or Michael the archangel, or Jacob, even Adam, with the angel of the Lord, with the commander of the Lord's armies, with the visible presence of God. Different Hebrew texts depict other figures in this highly exalted position. And in Ezekiel's play, it's Moses in this position. So as I've alluded, there are more texts that have different identifications. There are more texts which teach a complexity of God's nature. Philo of Alexandria is a great example, and in due time I might make a video about him. He is another indigenous Israelite from Egypt, or from Kemet. So we actually have, which is true both for the early church and for the Israelite community, is both but the time before Christ and after Christ. Really, North Africa, especially Egypt, especially Alexandria, would really be like the hub for the things of God in a lot of ways, in my opinion. We have a lot of these diaspora Hebrews living in Alexandria, or writing their works in Alexandria. We have Philo, we have Ezekiel, then we have a lot of church fathers and church leaders from Alexandria who in some manner of time would have been familiar with this material, or familiar with the Jews who still lived there, the Hebrew countrymen who lived alongside them. Again, read Eusebius's stuff for how he exalts the Egyptian Hebrews. So there's a lot of dope stuff. There's a lot of great gems that we can dig out. But when we understand that these ideas were firmly recognized within the diaspora, and that they primarily come from the scriptures, we can see a clear gateway for Christ in these discussions. Because when we understand that Moses was exalted in this way, and this was something that the Jews did with Moses and other figures, when we can see that Moses was put on God's throne and Moses was put on God's authority, we can make sense of when Christ comes and is portrayed in the same way, because there's a precedent within this community, within this diaspora of the children of God. So when we get that out of the way, we can put Christ under scrutiny and see that when it comes to either men of God such as Moses, or even false messiahs that would come after the time of Christ, both angles, both in terms of false messiahs and men of God, when it comes to who God's visible presence is, and we look at all these different people who said it's this guy or it's this guy, when we get Christ and we put him under scrutiny, we see how Jesus, Yeshua, is vindicated in that position, as opposed to any of these other figures, whether they be false messiahs or legitimate men of God in the scriptures. So let me put it like this, because now I'm gonna briefly explain what Christians believe from a Hebraic lens that maybe you never heard of before. As a Christian, we acknowledge no other God but the Most High, the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, or as some brothers say, Yahweh. We acknowledge no other deity but the Most High of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who selected a people for himself, brought them out of slavery from Kemet or Egypt into the Promised Land, and had a sincere plan for them. Okay? But just as the ancient Hebrews did, we recognize that God's nature is complex. This is the same type of foundation that the Gentile churches would later articulate as the Trinity or the Selassie in indigenous languages, okay? But the foundational concepts are recognized by different authors in the Diaspora. So all that being said, while we acknowledge no other God but the Most High, we recognize that his nature was complex. And we believe the visible Yahweh has been fully revealed in the ministry and life and person of Jesus, or Yeshua of Nazareth. So, the divine cloud rider of Israel. I have a video about it that I highly recommend. Acknowledged by the children of Israel. Everyone acknowledged this figure. Everyone believed in the Most High, but they recognized that he had two powers in heaven. Everyone who believed this type of thing, we come into the conversation saying, we believe this too. We acknowledge no other God, but we believe the divine cloud rider has been revealed. He has been tangibly revealed, and we can track that point in history 2,000 years ago with the ministry of Christ and the message that lived down through his apostles and their followers and the writings that we have in the New Testament. It might sound strange to so many people, but that goes to show how alienated we are from this Hebraic stuff, that even the thought of this sounds strange, but that goes to show how much we've been influenced by rabbinic doctrine, which denied all of this, which actually comes after the judgment, after the destruction of the temple. You see what I'm saying? But the authentic stuff before then, which comes from the scriptures, we can see the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites acknowledge. And when we go from that perspective, we can see how consistent the proclamation of Christ is, and how he's vindicated within that role. We acknowledge no other God besides the Most High. Christ taught against idols. The apostles were adamantly against idols. So we have it on both ends. No idolatry, no daemon, only Yahweh. But just as the saints acknowledge, we have identified the divine cloud rider. He has made himself known to Israel, and we can vindicate him in a number of ways. So that is going to be one of my future videos, might be my next video, about how we can, on a non-presuppositional level, meaning without already believing it, we can vindicate Christ from an Old Testament Hebraic prophetic perspective as a historical figure and see him come out with a giant, massive W. So if y'all are interested in that, or if y'all are skeptical, I highly recommend y'all check around. Here I'm giving primary sources of just one brother during the time before Christ who recognized these things, and there's plenty more. Many of these sources also come from Africa. So for brothers and sisters out there in the black community who take either a Hebrew identity or just, indulge in being a child of the Most High, who do not realize that their understanding of God is rabbinic, please check out these things with a humble heart, man, because I'm giving you primary African sources of African Hebrews, of which there's more than one, that recognize the Lord was complex. And when we understand these things, we can see the glory of God and the glory of Christ in the testimony of the scriptures. So with that being said, I pray y'all be blessed in the Most High Yahweh, in the Most High Yahweh, or as some more people will say, my grandmother calls him Jehovah. And y'all be blessed, blessed, blessed in the Messiah, or as some other brothers would say, the Messiah. And I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.